So we've talked about overarching principles, and we've also talked about page level principles. Let's bring it down and talk about paragraph level principles of document design. The first one I want to talk about is justification. Justification means how the text is laid out in the column on the page. Now you can have a single column, which is the most common that you are probably used to. You can have multiple columns per page. When you full justify a paragraph, that means you're taking the text, spreading it out, and making both sides of the text touch the margins on both sides of the column. Big newspapers, magazines, these things are often full justified. That's because they have professional layout software that especially works for layouts of this kind. Unless you know exactly, and I mean exactly, what you are doing with layout, I would recommend very strongly that you avoid full justification. You probably want to stick with left justified instead. Well, let's illustrate what's going on here. So I've taken a page from a magazine, I've mocked it up, and then I've also mocked it up, but instead of using full justification like I did in the original, I've left justified it. So when we look at these things, the one on the right looks a little more professional in a way because, yeah, I mean, it's, it looks like a magazine does. It's got that text that touches both sides of the columns. But take a look at this. Yeah, notice what's going on here? You probably know, wait a minute, there it goes again, there it goes again. So each of these lines, this is what we call a lake or a river. So we've mostly got rivers going on here. Whenever your reader's eye goes across and finds a streak of white, the human eye is attracted to brightness. So every time your reader sees a river, the eye goes down the page instead of across the column. That's why on the left there, the left justified text is easier to read than the right justified text. So for your purposes, especially in this class when you're using Microsoft Word and the like, I would recommend left justification. You can also do right justification. It's a little more unusual. It's usually reserved for art purposes. You can center justify. So centering is just a kind of justification. I would recommend that you reserve centering for special purposes. For the most part, when you're doing text, left justify it. The next idea that you probably haven't heard before is a thing called line leading. It's the amount of space between lines inside the same paragraph. Notice it's pronounced leading, like the metal lead or Led Zeppelin. Here's an example of what it is. It is the space between the base lines inside the same paragraph. So you think about what a baseline is. If you draw a line across the bottom of all, the common bottom of all the lowercase letters, and anything that does not have a descender, it's just that where you, like, think about this, when you learn how to handwrite, your teacher probably gave you some lined paper, or as a matter of fact, when you're taking notes now, you probably are not scrawling across a blank piece of paper. You probably have lined paper there, and you're making all the bottoms of your letters match up with that horizontal line. The amount of space between the lines there, that is your leading. The thing that's happening here is that the leading can make a big difference in what your paper looks like, and make a difference in how easy it is to read. So on the left-hand side, I've got you a single-space paper, and on the right-hand side, I've got 120%. What I've done is I've taken the font size, multiplied by 120%, and used that to set the amount of leading. Which of these looks more professional? Which looks easier to read? Odds are, you're probably looking at the 120% space paper and saying, yeah, that one's a lot easier to read. That is because, well, that's the answer. Single spacing is not bad. It can be used, it's fine, but to make things nice, to make it better, I would recommend messing with your leading. And I will show you when we start talking about how to use Microsoft Word tools, how to adjust that leading. Just as a thought, you may be wondering why it's called leading. I'll talk about that very briefly. Back in the day, when printing presses were first invented, the letters were kept in a box. So you'd reach and you put the letters put the letters in a rack, and then when you come to the end of the line, you go to the next line and start putting letters in the rack again. What happens, though, to the amount of space, vertical space between those letters? If you have no extra space in there, they all run together and they look like a big old blob. It turns into art rather than readable text. So what the printers would do is they would take actual strips of lead, insert them between the various lines of text, and that's why it's now called leading, because you used lead to create vertical space between the lines of text. Paragraph spacing. It's similar to the idea of leading, but it's between paragraphs. So each time you hit the Enter key on, say, Microsoft Word, how much space appears between that paragraph you just finished and the paragraph that begins next. I would suggest very strongly that you would always want to adjust the default spacing between paragraphs. When you use defaults on Microsoft Word and other programs, you are showing that you don't really know what you are doing very much. You can do basic things, but you can't do anything sophisticated. If you start to mess with these things and make it look really nice, you're going to impress people like you would not believe. Also, one thing that it will not impress people is if you hit Enter twice to make paragraphs. Now, I should put an asterisk by this and say things like on D2L or when you're working in a text editor, then you pretty much have to hit Enter twice. But especially on Microsoft Word or any program where you can adjust the amount of paragraph spacing automatically, I would do so and avoid hitting Enter, because that's really old school and it's a thing that's left over from typewriter days. Here's an example of what we're talking about. So on the left-hand side, I've taken Microsoft Word and I've set it up just as straight up single spacing with zero space between paragraphs, and I've hit Enter twice at the end of each paragraph. It's kind of lame looking, isn't it? On the right-hand side, I've used Microsoft Word Styles function, which I'm going to teach you guys how to use, and I've set the amount of space after each time you hit Enter. Notice, it looks a lot more slick, doesn't it? Yeah, it's actually easier to read as well because your reader's eye doesn't have to move quite so far across big deserts of white. So that's why I recommend that you adjust your paragraph spacing. Heading hierarchies. Headings are text, or usually, I want to say text, they can be images, but usually pieces of text that are beginning at each major section, minor sections too. So you're going to have a major section with a heading, a minor section with a heading. These things are nested. The level 1 heading is always biggest and boldest. It's like Papa Bear. It's big, it's bad, it's swinging its arms around. Then we got lower level headings. So Mama Bear is a little smaller, Baby Bear is smaller than that. So you want to create contrast among these levels of heading. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. The thing is, any heading can contain multiple different lower level headings. So you can have a level 1 heading that then contains a level 2 heading, and another level 2 heading, and that second level 2 heading can hold a level 3, and that level 3 can hold a level 4, and another level 4, and then go back to a level 3, then go back to a level 2. So in this case, you'd have one major heading of heading 1, 3 subheadings of heading 2, and the second subheading of level 2 would have 2 instances of level 3. Odds are you can probably get by, especially with the documents that you are going to be creating, with 3 levels of heading, no more than that. If you start to use more than 3 levels of heading, you're getting into the weeds, and it can get really challenging to do a good job of document design. So I would suggest that for most purposes, 3 levels of heading is probably enough for you to use. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is a page from my dissertation. I just pulled it out so you have an example of what to look at. So at the top, I've got a level 1 heading. That's my chapter title. I've got a level 2 heading. The article analysis tells me what article I'm looking at. Level 3 heading, that then tells me this is the smaller section of the level 2 heading. And then I've got presentation previous research. That is a sub-chunk of the introduction section. So I've actually got 4 levels of heading going on here. Please notice one thing that's going on with this levels of heading is that there's contrast between all of them, but at the same time, they all have some repetition that they hang together. I'll talk more a little later about techniques for doing that. So when we talk about heading contrast, your headings need to look similar but different. They're usually going to use variations on the same typeface, but those headings are going to use a different typeface from the main text. Let's take a look at what's going on here. I would also recommend that levels font sizes should differ by at least 2 points. So when you start picking fonts and you say, like, I want this to be so big, those are measured in quote-unquote points. A level 1 heading should be at least 2 points bigger than level 2. 2 points should be at least 2 points bigger than level 3. I would recommend probably more than that, but at the very least 2 points. If it's only 1 point, it's almost impossible to see the difference. If it's 2 points, it's usually fairly subtle. A heading 1 is going to have more white space above and below it than heading 2. So remember I talked about heading 1 as Papa Bear? Well, he's big, he's bad, he's going to swing his arms around. You got to make sure that there's nothing in the reach of his arms. Then you got Mama Bear. Mama Bear's a little smaller, she swings her arms, there's less white space, so to speak, around her. Then Baby Bear swings its little stubby little legs and arms around, there's even less space. Here's again an example of exactly what we're talking about. Notice each of these blue lines. So my level 1 heading, I've got a whole bunch of space. Level 2 heading, I got some space there. Level 3, less space. Level 4, a little less space. Now, admittedly, this is not the perfect example because the amount of space between level 1 and level 2 looks to be about the same, and the amount of space between level 3 and level 4 is very, very similar. That being said, I could have done a better job on this, but it'll serve as an example of the sort of thing that you want to do.